speakers today. Christy Hoffman, General Secretary of UNI Global Union, and Sabrina Ritossa Fernandez from Sycamore Asset Management. And if I may introduce them briefly, without of course doing them any justice at all. Christy leads UNI Global's work with more than 100 multinational employers, including global agreements negotiated with almost 60 major firms to ensure strong protections for their workforce. Christy has worked with investors for many years, informing them of risks in investee companies and highlighting the importance of addressing social ESG issues. She's worked extensively with legal and institutional frameworks for corporate accountability, such as the OECD guidelines and French duty of vigilance law. Christy was also an architect of the groundbreaking Bangladesh Accords for building and fire safety, the first legally binding agreement for supply chain responsibility. Welcome, Christy. Sabrina Ritossa Fernandez is an ESG analyst and portfolio manager at Sycamore Asset Management, a signatory to the WDI, and a leader in responsible investment with a long-term approach to the S of ESG. Sabrina is in the investment team of the Happy at Work Fund, a 400 million euro in assets SRI fund, which selects companies based on their human capital approach, noting that happy employees drive corporate value. Sabrina is also currently working with external consultants to formalize Sycamore's human rights approach as an investor, and as a company is leading Sycamore's efforts in becoming a B corporation. Thank you both for being with me and us today and sharing your knowledge on these issues. Before we get into the discussion, I'd just like to share my screen with Rosie. Sorry, I don't know if that's possible in the presenter. Maybe you could share it instead. I wanted to outline, thanks Rosie. Rosie is of course the investor, the company engagement manager who you all probably know very well from the company side. So employee social dialogue, and we wanted to share a few stats with you from the data set, the WDI data set 2019, because of course this is where we devise some of the themes for our workshops and webinars, yeah, gather stakeholders together on these issues. What we've learned from the 2019 data set is that the data reveal that companies do not appear to be collecting data relating to social dialogue mechanisms, and this in turn undermines their ability to monitor labor relations. While 72% of companies disclose the percentage of their direct operations workforce covered by collective bargaining agreements, only 27% provided a geographic breakdown of the coverage by location. The average number of locations for which companies provided a percentage of collective bargaining coverage was just 3 overall. Thankfully, the vast majority of companies, 97% in fact, disclosed a policy commitment to provide grievance mechanisms. 94% provided details of their grievance mechanisms, but notably less than half of the companies revealed the number of grievances raised by direct operations workers during the reporting period. Only 74% of these also disclosed the number of grievances resolved. The 2020 survey, moving on, and you can see some of the data points on worker representation and grievance mechanisms that I'm showing in the current slides. We have 3 sections and 19 questions which capture data on worker voice, grievance mechanisms, and supply chain worker rights. And so these questions have been designed in consultation with our trade union, investor, and company stakeholders in order to elicit the most useful information. And we're really hoping that, you know, this year companies report as much as they can on these data points, you know, for our investors, but also to identify any gaps that they have. All of these resources, by the way, are on the website available to view. And so with that introduction, I'd like to get straight into the talking points today. And Christy, maybe we can start with you. My first question is, and I think just to set the scene of this, can you explain the background to and importance of employee social dialogue, I mean, what do we mean by the term, and what does it capture, in your opinion?
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for sharing those data points with us right off the bat. I think one of our concerns for quite a long time is that the amount of social dialogue that's actually happening is rarely disclosed, and it is far too little. But what is social dialogue? It's a term used to typically describe relationships between worker representatives, employers, and government, ranging from collective bargaining to negotiation and discussion about regulatory frameworks. Typically, it's a phrase used more commonly in Europe, not as much, frankly, outside of Europe and US and Asia, North America and Asia, but it is a broad framework of worker representation and discussions with employers. Now, in COVID, in most countries of Western Europe, unions, governments, and companies negotiated about specific safety measures on the job, as well as the relief packages. That's a good example of social dialogue. But it's important to clarify that social dialogue is absent when workers don't have independent representation. It's founded on the fundamental rights of a freedom of association and collective bargaining. And these are important core rights in and of themselves, but they're also considered to be enabling rights because they enable workers themselves to safeguard the protection of other core human rights through the process of social dialogue.
That's great, Christy. And if I jump straight into another kind of big question, and maybe you can lead on this. I mean, is there a link between employee social dialogue and the concept of stakeholder capitalism, for example, which seems to be kind of a new buzzword? And then on the back of that, there's also, the concept of a just transition. What is the relationship between employee social dialogue and these two kind of rather obtuse terms?
Well, surely you don't have stakeholder capitalism without social dialogue, truly involving workers as a fundamental stakeholder. Now, I say that word with some caution because workers are not just a normal stakeholder, as the word is typically used. Workers have an internationally legal relationship with a company, unlike many others that might be considered stakeholders. But in any event, with taking the buzzword as it is, you can't have stakeholder capitalism without social dialogue. Now, as far as just transition goes, absolutely, that social dialogue is a key enabler of just transition because it means that workers are part of the process to enable the climate transition without them being left behind. And we know that this is a critical piece of building widespread public support for a just transition.
And Amy, if I can add on that, I'm totally aligned with Christy, and I would like to draw the attention on the current policy priorities of the European Union. As you probably know, the European Union is working on the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And although much of the attention today is being drawn, of course, to the environmental piece, let's not forget that there is a very important safeguards piece turned around human rights as defined by the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the United Nations Guiding Principles for Human Rights. And these guidelines specifically address freedom of association and collective bargaining. And so I think as investors as well, we're going to be asked more and more to explain how do we do due diligence on these aspects.
Yeah, it's funny then that you should mention that you can't have stakeholder capitalism or just transition without employee social dialogue, when a number, and I won't name any names, of the Business Roundtable, one in particular has pledged their support of this, when really kind of behind the scenes and not so behind the scenes has kind of stopped this collective bargaining in process, which is interesting, and obviously yeah, something for them to look into further, I guess. And Sabrina, if I could ask you, what does employee social dialogue mean to you as an investor then? And can you explain how the company analyzes and engages with its various stakeholder groups?
Sure. Sure. At Sycomore, first of all, the fundamental analysis of companies that we do is based already on a stakeholder model, where we analyze the impact of a company on all of its stakeholders. So society, people, investors, clients, and environment. And this is why we call it SPICE. So, and SPICE, this framework is on the basis of the price we're willing to pay for a stock, is at the basis of the selection criteria of our SRI funds, and in general, all of our investment decisions. And so, as you mentioned before, we do have a fund dedicated to human capital as well, which is Sycamore Happy at Work, where I work. And we also have, for instance, a credit fund, which key criteria, one of the key criteria is the social climate, because we think that it's such an important tail risk as well for a business of having a tense workforce or having really bad and strained relationship with unions. And so, for instance, this is one of the reasons why we didn't invest in some airlines, to give you an example. Although, of course, then it wasn't social dialogue that made the airlines go bust, but okay, that's another topic. And so, for us, this kind of analysis of the social dialogue part, social climate, is really important, but it's very challenging at the same time as well. So to really understand the state of social dialogue in a company, of course, we rely on the company data, although as your presentation showed very well, it's not always available and in the way we need it. We also rely a lot on news flow. Historically, we've been talking with experts a lot, especially if issues are happening outside of Europe, where we are not so used and with the legislation and so on. And I would like to say that it's been now 2 years that we've been in touch with UNI as well, with Christy's organization, and really on a specific case. And it has been really, really helpful for us to be in touch with them, collaborate with them, because we get firsthand testimony from employees. We really understand the reality on the ground, because sometimes our job can seem a bit overwhelming, dealing with all these things from our computers. So it's been really, really helpful to be in touch with them. And we're also starting to gain a better understanding of global agreements, for instance. What does it mean? How can they provide comfort for investors on the fact that social dialogue is managed the way it should be?
And just quickly, do you think more investors are kind of cottoning on to the importance and value of social dialogue? I know Sycamore is quite specialist in that way, and it's pioneered this Happy at Work fund. But do you see that happening more generally across the board?
I do, of course. We hear a lot these days talking about ESG. After COVID, we've seen as well a lot of interest, increasing interest in the S of ESG. But I still think that the social part is a bit of the poor relative today of the environment. And I hope with all the new legislation coming up and new kind of commitments that are being pushed, we're going to see more and more real actual interest for social elements.
Thanks, Sabrina. Christy, I guess, getting down to brass taxes then, why is an engaged workforce important to a business? What are the benefits? And are there certain industries or business models for which employees' social bargaining is more effective or more important?
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, we know the idea of increasing unions and collective bargaining, those are not historically what investors have pushed companies to do. But we would challenge that approach and say that they should these collective bargaining should be welcomed and encouraged, because having social dialogue has a demonstrated record of benefits for businesses and investors. On a macroeconomic level, and here I think we have to really think macro at this moment in history with raging inequality. Macroeconomic, it's a key component to addressing the systemic risks of inequality, helps create more resilient economies to weather the ups and downs, shown to be very important right now. On the company level, easy to understand that union representation has found to reduce turnover, increase efficiency, productivity. It's also a key enabling factor to address other sustainable business priorities. So, for example, collective bargaining addresses gender inequality. It's no secret that women who belong to unions have a smaller gender gap, much smaller than others across the economy. Also provide a channel for raising issues of harassment and discrimination, better family-friendly benefits. And I would say that the question of having a grievance procedure, as you indicated earlier, that some businesses haven't been willing to say how many grievances use their company plan, the company grievance procedure, without having a union to ensure the safety of the safety of participants and, you know, to protect against retaliation. Those grievance procedures are not very successful at all without having independent representation. So all of those things can be addressed more easily, more effectively with a union, in a union environment, in a social dialogue environment. Now, when you talk about COVID, social dialogue has been critical for businesses on health and safety. Long been the case, whether the most unsafe, from the most unsafe industries, such as, for example, mining or, you know, garment production, to the more considered safe industries such as grocery store workers. Having a union has improved those conditions and been able, given workers more confidence that they're operating in a safe environment, and has been critical to saving lives. You know, ultimately, it does contribute towards having a resilient company. It's a signal of healthy social dialogue and participatory governance. Companies with this have their own accountability mechanisms with channels to address issues directly with worker representatives. So there's many benefits, and our history, our experience would show that these issues are true across all industries, from very classic factory workers to IT workers, to people who make movies and television shows, to professional athletes. These are some of the workers that UNI represents, not factory workers, but the others. And, you know, all of these industries have their own rhythm and their own culture, but they all benefit, the workers benefit greatly from having the benefits of social dialogue and collective bargaining. And when the businesses are operating in higher risk environments that the government will not protect their core rights, is perhaps where a union, collective bargaining and social dialogue is the most important. But unfortunately, that's where we see fewer unions and less collective bargaining. And so singling out some countries like Bangladesh or the Philippines, for example, where, you know, that's where unions are needed more than ever, but that's where we have, let's say, weak rule of law.
And if I can, thank you, Christy, and if I can, I totally agree with you. This is what we've seen as well on our side as investors. We see that companies that had a healthier dialogue were also less disrupted during the pandemic. But I wanted to touch specifically on a point you mentioned, that social dialogue is important in all sectors and not only those high risk. I think this is something that we're starting to gain more and more awareness on, especially I'm thinking about a recent controversy on a gaming company regarding sexual harassment. And nobody would have, something that nobody would have expected from a company where people tend to be overall in very good working conditions. And so now going forward, I think a big focus of our work will be to making sure that grievance mechanisms are applied across the board by all sectors in all industries, and are actually taken seriously and being reported on, which is also very important for us investors to see that there is actually progress happening. It's not like we want to see that there is no alert. We actually want to see that there are many alerts to make sure that when things are being brought to management, they're actually taken care of, and there is a follow-up after.
Yeah, that's great. And so I guess I'll go back to Christy then. And I mean, Sabrina, you mentioned it yourself. Knowing that collective bargaining, effective grievance mechanisms are important to a business, how can businesses then provide fertile soil for employee social dialogue to take place? What has to happen Is that a cultural thing? You know, is that a mechanistic thing? Any experience, Christy, would be great.
Well, a fertile soil, it's an excellent question. I mean, I would say that one of the biggest features that we see in terms of an unfertile soil, or the common obstacle, is that there's fear at the workplace, that people legitimately, I mean, we're facing this every single day, that somebody who was trying to create a union was dismissed. In fact, 2 this week, and it's Thursday, so maybe it's not every day, but that's only the ones that came to my attention on our campaigns. It's happening a lot. And so we believe that businesses, if they are sincere, if they are legitimately aiming to create a level playing field, let alone fertile soil, but a playing field where people can express themselves freely, they have to take proactive steps to form a foundation. And this includes a due diligence process to look to identify the risks that these rights will be denied, and to put in very robust mitigation measures. And we argue that companies should work with trade unions locally, nationally, and globally on this process. The risk assessments are important, but and we're certainly happy to be very proactive in helping to identify the risks. Many of them we're aware of, and some of these big multinationals, we know where it's very hard for workers to speak out. And then training local management, we found that to be very effective, that management has to be trained not to do what they might think they're supposed to do, which is to really crush any efforts to organize and silence that effort. And most managers in hostile environments for union think that that's their job, and they should be trained to the contrary, to create an open environment, to recognize and negotiate in good faith with local unions, to consider having a global agreement with a global union federation so that we can provide a framework of rights and accountability measures. That's one of the main purposes of our global agreements, is so that we can work with companies on creating fertile soil. And that's what we see as one of our most important roles that we can play.
I was on mute there. Every meeting like this. That's great, Christy. I was going to touch on another question, and that's surrounding legitimacy, because you know, it's an important factor when companies are making these grievance mechanisms and feedback channels. Can you just say a little bit about that, about legitimacy and why it's important?
Well, I mean, if we see so often that that these tools are just, people are not going to be honest when they're speaking into, when they're addressing some of these tools without any protection around them, around dismissal. So many countries have no laws to even protect you from unjust dismissal. I mean, so we look at some of these tools with a lot of skepticism, because they fail to take the underlying dynamics into account. And we know how much it takes to overcome this inherent fear in order to really enable workers to speak freely on issues, let alone to feel empowered to make changes on their own. And that, I think, a hotline, a committee, a survey just isn't adequate. I mean, I've heard stories where employers their compensation is linked to how employees respond on a survey. Do I think that survey is a freely taken survey? No. I think managers encourage employees to vote in a certain way. I think that, you know, the hotlines, I've never seen hotlines that really work. I must say, I can't say I've seen them all. We have a grievance mechanism, a complaints mechanism in the Bangladesh Accord. That's not a union, that's an accord, but we do have independent status to you know, sort of shepherd these workers through the process when they bring complaints. It took us a lot of time to persuade workers that this was a legitimate process and that they would not be, you know, thrown out, thrown to the wolves, so to speak. So I think that these processes, you really have to take into account the power dynamics at work and whether people see that they will feel protected if they're complaining about one of their colleagues or supervisors in particular.
Yeah, Sabrina, do you have anything to add on that? I know that these are kind of indicators that investors tend to look for when they're assessing a company. And I'm wondering just how can you get to the bottom of that legitimacy question?
Sorry, I also cut off my mic. So as I said, we are paying more and more attention to grievance mechanisms, how they're being implemented, whether they're independent, whether alerts are being followed up on. And so to judge of all of this, we can only base ourselves on the transparency that is given from the company. So now on the top of my mind, as an example, I think Adidas has been doing a pretty good job in this and in the way they're transparent, especially in their supply chain. And now I think the challenge going forward is going to be to convince companies that think that they don't have any risk because they operate in this IT services sector, gaming and so on, that they also need to take these channels seriously, and that they need to report on that and on them for investors to see that they're working and that alerts are being taken seriously. So I think this is going to be a focus going forward on more transparency and independence in this kind of mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that brings us on to another point about kind of technology and the way that it enables more communication to a certain extent, but as Christy said, that might not be as honest and as open as it looks from the outside. And I'm wondering kind of how, Christy, first of all, you view the positive and negative effects of technology and how we can balance those going forward. And then the same question to Sabrina would be fantastic. Thank you.
In terms of the grievance procedure, you mean? Well, we obviously, in terms of the impact of technology, right now, I think some people say we're seeing 2 years, 5 years condensed into 1 or 10 years condensed into 2. All of the technological trends underway are getting accelerated right now. That's what we experience, and that's certainly what others report. And so obviously that affects workers in a lot of different ways. We are looking at new forms of surveillance as people work from home. That gives a lot of concern. New forms of AI monitoring that may be, we expect will be permanent. Let's just take as an example, call centers that are moving their work not only to remote work during the pandemic, but a lot of that work, let's say in the case of one company, it'll be over 100,000 workers. They're going to be working from home from now on, where there's extensive capacity to introduce AI technology, not just to make sure they're working, which is one kind of surveillance, but to listen to every call and judge it and take over some of the tasks that the worker might have done, which is essentially a good amount of speed up, but at the same time, very, very invasive. So there's a big demand right now on the part of unions to be engaged in negotiating around these issues. Unis develop principles. There's a lot of sort of discussion about what model kind of proposals could look like. And there are unions negotiating around the use of this technology in many sectors. So worker rights have to be at the center of the impact of this technology. And we've been talking about it for a long time, but I think this crisis has made it much more concrete and sped things along considerably.
And yeah, and on our side, the surveillance is clearly one of the points we've been looking at in the companies we own in our portfolios. Well, another simple point in the short term was simply to give workers the equipment that was necessary to do the job, which is actually didn't always happen. Although now, by the way, the regulator is catching up. I've seen that in Spain, Greece, Ireland, they're trying to promote legislation to actually put a framework on remote working. But then on the longer term, we're also worried about the risk of excessive social dumping, because now that the pool of workers is global, competition is global, and companies can be tempted to actually put excessive pressure on salaries. So of course, on the positive side, more jobs could be given to people who work on the periphery of big cities, on the rural, on the countryside, but this shouldn't mean an excessive devaluation of labor, of course. So this is something we're trying to make up our mind around. And also in the long term, I think it's going to be important to work on culture for companies, because the culture cannot be the same if you're working physically together or at home. You need to give more autonomy to people. You need to give them more trust. And for sure, AI system and surveillance system cannot make up for that. So these are going to be the points that we're going to look into in the future when talking about the future of work on our side. What we agree on is that there are different, from investors on this topic, there are different layers of engagement. So first, you can and you should try with, trying to convince companies of the actual value of treating properly their employees, and the value of communication, because the company is an unicum and social dialogue is what sticks the company together and makes sure that the company is resilient. So this is the first layer. Then Marcus was sharing his very interesting experience working in big multinationals supply chain. And he was explaining how you need to, as an investor, to be careful on the wording, so not be too strict on what you're asking the company, but for instance, asking the company to uphold the code of conduct is more than legitimate for an investor. And then it's up to the company to decide behind how they're going to organize, with which trade unions they're going to talk, and so on. But then it's true that when situation gets tense and when the relation is hard, this is a very sensitive issue for an investor, because it can get a bit political. The company can turn up on the investor. So it's important to move together, whether through collective action or by making sure that investors repeat over and over the same questions and point the finger to the same issue. And it's also important to use all the instruments we have in our disposal, like the corporate human rights benchmark, for example, to put additional pressure on a company. And maybe as a final note, we also need to be very, very clear on what we're asking, whether it is collective bargaining, whether it is individual grievance mechanisms, and all of this at least should start with asking the companies to be more transparent, which is the VDI's work as well. So I think all starts as well with transparency, having the numbers in front of us, and having some common ground to talk about and to speak on. I hope I resumed the concrete pieces of our discussion. I don't know if you have anything to add, Marcus and Claire.
I think, Claire, your point around modern slavery was really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Maybe Claire, you wanna pick up on it?
Well, just talk. Sorry, I missed the start of Sabrina talking because my headphones stopped working. So apologies if I repeat anything. But part of what we were talking about was the potential of using conversations connected to, say, just transition issues on the climate side or modern slavery to approach conversations or the dialogue around workforce engagement without necessarily scaring companies off in quite the same way as they might otherwise feel it was a threat. That actually workforce engagement in the context of just transition is essential in order to be able to deliver that strategy. And on the modern slavery side of things, it's essential as a way of actually monitoring potential risks, so that within that kind of risk framework, it's actually essential for investors and companies to be talking more around those issues and understanding what's going on. And that's then an entry point to having more of a discussion around actually, you know, freedom of association and those wider issues.
Thank you, Claire. And just for information, the kind of title of our discussion group was how investors can use their power effectively in this area, and what would companies like to see investors doing more of. And this is really as interactive as you make it at this point. So if you do have any questions and would like to raise any points in response to that, please do write it in the chat, or even just, you know, unmute yourselves and we can discuss. Christy, I wonder if you might be able to kind of outline the nature of your discussion.
Sure. Our topic was, how can employers provide fertile soil for social dialogue? And, you know, we had a small group, 3 of us were from the United States. So that's one of the more hostile countries to employer social dialogue. And I think that presents a certain perspective. But and the point I would make is, if employers would just stay neutral, that would make a huge difference. If employers would just refrain from campaigning against unions, that would enormously make the difference in the United States. But I do think that the other comments were agreeing, yeah, we need management training. We need to make hotlines and employee grievance mechanisms more user-friendly for employees through more transparency about them. A better system to communicate in group settings, because workers are afraid to go straight to their supervisors with complaints, and these would be in a non-union setting. So how could you improve things in a non-union setting would be, yeah, better communication and more transparency about the effectiveness and credibility of the actual grievance mechanisms. But the other point that came up in our workshop, our breakout, was the example of one participant who worked for a company, Vinci, which had a global agreement with BWI, the Building Workers Global Union, which is our sister global union in building trades industry in Qatar. And through that agreement was able to create a social dialogue mechanism in a country which is where unions are even illegal. And that was a tremendous effort to slowly bring the employers along on the ground, Vinci, but the managers have to be trained to be open to this, to get the workers to accept that they can elect representatives and choose representatives and be part of a grievance mechanism, get the government to agree to it in a country where you know, unions are not allowed. So that's a really big effort. And I think it's through a global agreement with the global union, which we obviously endorse that because that's what we think our role is. But we are also working in Qatar in a similar project without a global agreement. It's not as successful without a global agreement with the employers, but we recognize the work that went into creating that environment is very groundbreaking. So we were lucky to have Henriette in our group to describe that effort.
Sorry, Christy, your first example with Vinci, which region or country was that?
Vinci, that was the agreement covered Qatar.
Okay, great, thank you.
I guess I say it in the wrong way yeah, it covered Qatar. So, and where unions are not allowed. So it's been an effort there to create an ability to have worker committees and a grievance mechanism in the absence of a union, but also with credibility and with a global union on site to pull it all together with the employer.
Like Christy said, the fact that unions were not allowed in Qatar did not prevent us as employer to build a platform where we had monthly meetings between the employer and workers. We had committees since 2011 in Qatar on our work sites, but and we organized elections. So although they did not have a legal right to bargain their salary, and at the time there was no minimum salary, by the way, nothing prevents employers to have dialogue, even if unions are not allowed. So we used the fact that it was not forbidden to meet within the company to talk about training, to talk about the living facilities, to talk about the allowance, let's say how much the employee gets to go home, or about salary increase. Nothing prevented us from organizing a dialogue around these issues. So like you said, all it takes is an employer which is not anti-union or anti-dialogue.
Thank you, Henriette. I've noticed there's a question here, but let me first go to the final discussion group. I'm not sure who is designated as the leader on that one, but maybe you could discuss your points, and then we'll get to the questions finally, and then maybe wrap up.
Hi. So our question was, we had two questions. How do you ensure that employees see feedback and grievance mechanisms as legitimate and effective? And how do you ensure non-retaliation and the protection of workers? So in terms of seeing grievance mechanisms and feedback as legitimate and effective, there was, I think, a big kind of consensus that it's really important that the values that underpin that are demonstrated throughout the organization, particularly from the top, and that there's structures in place that show that kind of feedback and employee consultation is consistently spoken about and valued by an organization. And there was also, I think we all agreed, like unions were made a really, really big difference in terms of people actually accessing grievance mechanisms and feedback mechanisms, people understanding what they are and having the confidence to use them as well. There's discussion around the fact that workers can be afraid to raise issues, and that it can sometimes not be clear what will happen if they do raise issues. So having an independent means of representation through unions can make the whole thing work a lot more easily, and it takes that sort of the power dynamic out of the question slightly. And also that a big thing that people thought was really important was actually seeing change from these mechanisms, that if organizations are consistently going out and asking for surveys and asking for employee feedback, and then employees don't see anything, workers don't see anything being done about those things, then it just looks like a tick box exercise. Eventually people get quite cynical about it, and people stop taking it seriously and stop engaging. So it's really important that it's not just about having these mechanisms in place, it's about them actually being used to create change inside organizations. And in terms of the non-retaliation and the protection of workers, again, unions were seen as being absolutely crucial in this, and that if a grievance mechanism isn't working properly, or if workers are facing reprisals for using grievance mechanisms, then unions are really the main, if not the only, alternative to that. And that there were some possibilities of other stakeholders being able to have influence, so shareholders and people like that, but it requires a real collective effort to actually put that on people's agendas, and it's not something you can rely on, and it's not as easy to access, and definitely not guaranteed in the way that if you have a union it is. And also we had a discussion about the importance of actually having external accountability mechanisms in place, and that there is a need for regulatory buy-in when managers aren't respecting the social contract with employees, to try and, I guess, widen the range of options that there are available.
Thanks, Charlotte. That was great. Thank you so much for the feedback on all of those discussions. I had one question, kind of a rather selfish one on behalf of the WDI, but I think it's important to always kind of frame these discussions. And I might go to Sabrina, as a signatory. What do you think the WDI's role is in this debate, or how is it a useful tool? I mean, we talked about transparency, and I think that's really quite crucial, and that's obviously one of the ambitions of the WDI. But from a signatory standpoint, what do you think? How do you think the WDI can add to this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what you're doing already is great, trying to build some standards and some consensus around which kind of social data is crucial for investors, for companies, and to drive the conversation, to drive discussions. I think this kind of session that you've been doing, we've done the one on diversity, this one, I think they're also really useful to just exchange and kind of create a meeting point between companies and investors. Because I think sometimes, each one speaks their own language. We have our own preoccupations and we see the world in one way, and then companies see it in another way and civil society in another way. And so I think it's good if we can pull efforts together and understand each other and see how can we finally just drive change on the ground together in a concrete manner, beyond checklists, beyond, rules that are useless, and just having a concrete approach and thinking about this together and being driven by data that is actually useful.
I think that feeds into one of the questions that were asked about kind of in the chat. So how can you evaluate a union? Luanda has mentioned, some of the demands might not be well thought out or realistic. And I'm wondering, again, that leads to this kind of conflict situation. I'm wondering if you can offer any advice, on how to manage that.
Sure, it is an uncomfortable situation. I think sometimes because we do have a concrete case where we are talking about unions to a company, and for them, we shouldn't be doing so because for many reasons. But I think, so the way we have approached this is, okay, you don't like this union, so show us that you're talking to another union, or just that you're open to this kind of dialogue, because collective bargaining, it is a fundamental right. So this is all what we're asking. But as there is no other union they're talking to, so of course we're like, so why don't you talk to them? So I'm talking very concretely here, but so this is how we go about it. We just want this is, so as we are invested in these companies, we are linked somehow to what they're doing, and we have a responsibility to respect human rights, and collective bargaining, it is part of human rights, and it's a fundamental right. We just want it to be respected. And so the way they respect it, we don't care, we can say that. We don't care in the sense, as long as they respect it, we don't care. So now, sometimes there's not 1,000 unions, so sometimes the union is very big, it's very legitimate. So of course we're just gonna ask the question, why don't you collaborate with them? So this is one specific case. Then I think we're gonna go on a case by case basis, but the guiding principle is this kind of rights should be respected. So I don't know if Christy, want to add anything on what you're expecting from investors as well, from your perspective, or what the way you think investors should act and so on.
Well, what I would say is that it's really important that investors communicate to companies that this matters. I think you can't underestimate the impact that you have to say that you expect that your portfolio companies will pursue social dialogue and that you consider it a fundamental right. I think that is incredibly important and influential, and we need to move the dial so that companies think that this is an expectation that they will engage in collective bargaining and social dialogue, rather than an expectation that they should not or will not. And the second point I would like to make is I think the WDI transparency project on the extent to which companies have collective bargaining is incredibly important. It is so important, and I can't tell you how much I've been moaning about all the companies who brag about how great they are in collective bargaining, and they never disclose the reality that they don't have collective bargaining in Malaysia or in Poland, or just to name a few countries where many multinationals have operations, and or the US never. very, very seldom, but or Colombia, or just all these countries where it's so hard for workers who want unions, and these big employers who brag about being so ethical and won't disclose their collective bargaining gaps. And I really think just that transparency is so important. And I'm willing to push for that across Lisa will know I'm constantly saying, why can't we get transparency on this? So I'm very happy that you're doing it. I think it's very important. I think when you start transparency, it's a step towards recognizing this is worth measuring. It's recognizing that it's an important criteria. It's recognizing that it matters. And it's a slight incentive for employers to move in the other direction. And it's really, it may seem small, but I've raised it in other fora. I think we need to raise it I have raised it at the World Economic Forum, and I will continue to say that their ethical guidance should include transparency on bargaining. The global deal should have transparency on bargaining. There's all these different places, but I'm so glad that you've taken that approach because I think it's really important.
Sorry, I know we're slightly on time, but I would be really interested if Henriette is able to respond to the query that Marcus raised in the chat about the kind of motivations of Vinci in terms of risk or opportunity with your Qatar work, because I think that's kind of quite an interesting case study.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, what were Vinci's motivation and perceived value for dialogue in Qatar? More risk or opportunity focus?
So was it more risk or opportunity, like what prompted it?
What prompted it? A few things. The first one was how we could improve safety on site, and we wanted to involve the employees to discuss about what they thought was working or not. We had a very strong health and safety management plan, and a part of it was on having workers' committees. And BWI had entered into a dialogue with Vinci at more top level, where they came on a site visit and they said, look, we recognize that you have committees, but how can they be more legitimate? And therefore they encouraged us to organize elections. Therefore we took the risk to organize elections because I don't think that many companies were doing it at the time. So we had a committee since 2011, but it was more to collect grievances about the accommodation. It was not as wide and large as discussing work conditions and salaries, etc. And so the first step was to formalize the committee, to make it enter official into the company processes, to have a flow, to have an organizational chart, to have posters about who are the representatives and put them on site. And then the next step was to organize elections. So we didn't perceive it as risky. We quickly saw the benefits of having a good employee dialogue, because it's always better to know what's not working. Let's say if there's a complaint about I'm going to give a very concrete example about the luggage policy. When the migrant workers go home on holiday, the plane ticket is paid for by the company, but do they have an allowance for their luggage? And depending on the towns in India where they were going to, it was a different policy. And so we had a lot of complaints. And instead of having workers having to pay at the airport from their pockets, the fact that they talked about it during the committee allowed us to uniformize this our policy. And it's always better to preempt and anticipate on the problems rather than wait for big issues of having workers having to spend half a month's salary on something that they had not expected. So it really smoothened things. Some of the meetings were quite we talked very frankly, like the complaints were worded quite transparently from our workers, but we saw it as a sign that they felt confident. And then the fact that we organized elections made the unions trust us more. So then when there was an issue and when we talked about the issue and the solution that we brought, there was confidence from the unions that we were actually treating it rather than, oh, you're trying to hide what you're doing. So it was really a virtuous cycle. So I don't know if that answered your question. And I've seen another question about before.
It did. Thank you so much, Henriette. Thank you.
From Luyanda about how unions can be guided or evaluated. And I think it's quite an interesting question as well.
Yeah, how do you kind of assess from a company's perspective whether, like, when some demands are unrealistic or not very well thought through? Can you give any advice on that? Christy, maybe? I'm not sure if you have any experience with that.
I mean, I have loads of experience with that. I've negotiated collective agreements my whole life since I was about 25, and I'm a lot older than that now. So I would just say that, you know, yes, union leaders tend to be the more vocal ones, but union leaders have to be elected, and they also have to be pragmatic, and they want the employer to succeed. They want the business to succeed. And so I don't find that an unreasonable union leader, which is maybe the stereotype, is the reality. I think you want a win-win situation, and you want the workers, the realistic demands to be, you know, maybe they seem unrealistic at first from an employer's point of view. Wait a minute, no way, you know, but at the same time, I think almost always workers and employers are able to come out with a win-win solution, or a solution with which they're all happy. And, you know, especially you see this more often, I would say, when you have sectoral bargaining, and you know, enterprise bargaining is sometimes more difficult because it's the only business that has a union among many others that don't. But I do think that, and so I think sectoral bargaining is actually the best model in terms of getting both stability and good outcomes, and raising the floor for everyone, and not putting an employer at a disadvantage. But so, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that that really unions are not in the business of putting businesses out of business. You know, they want that there's a good solution for the employees, and almost all employees want their employer to do well and to succeed. And so I would just like to add one more comment on Henriette's story on Qatar, because UNI's really involved there as well. And I think it's a unique situation where, because of all the migrant workers in Qatar, and because of all the construction related to the World Cup, and Qatar being awarded the World Cup is quite controversial at first, because they don't have any minimum wage. They just this week in Qatar, as a result of the work of BWI and Vinci now, and UNI and ILO and the ITUC and so many others, this week they just, in fact, just yesterday, published in their official gazette a minimum wage and the right of workers to change jobs in Qatar, which is an incredible step forward, because before they had to work for the same employer who hired them. It was almost very close to a bonded labor kind of thing. And this is a momentous occasion, hasn't gotten a lot of press, but it's really the power of global pressure to move Qatar in the context of a major sporting event, which was very controversial. That triggered a lot of close inspection on the conditions for migrant workers in Qatar, and enabled progress to result from that. So it's a good story.
Scrutiny works.
Scrutiny, that's right, it was scrutiny. And I'm proud to say that as part of UNI, we have the world players that represent all the football players of the world, among many other athletes. And the world players were very, very much involved in putting the pressure on Qatar as well, because the athletes don't want to go and play football where there are no human rights respected. So, team effort.
Thank you all so much for your input on that. Really appreciate it, and apologies, we've run way over, but I hope you've taken some kind of nuggets of wisdom from all sides from that discussion. Just to let you know, yeah, so some of the session has been recorded. We will also send out summary notes to the registrants who perhaps couldn't attend. We are hosting a workshop with CCLA on modern slavery towards effective action at the beginning of October. That will be a similar setup to this. And just on the company side of things, to let you know, we've launched the online reporting platform that is open from now until the end of November. So please do disclose and get your own kind of narrative and own story across on these issues. Just to thank Christy once again and Sabrina for a fantastic discussion and just fantastic work that you're doing as well. Yeah, hope to speak to you all very shortly, and keep in touch and stay safe and stay well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.